It's funny how normal life can screech into chaos in the span of 10 seconds. I had just come back from an all-night shift, parked my ambulance in front of my own house, and leaned against the hood with that bone-deep exhaustion only EMTs understand. The neighborhood was still asleep, except for the one person who never seemed to rest. Karen, the HOA's self-appointed queen. Her SUV rounded the corner like it was patrolling enemy territory, and the moment her eyes locked on the ambulance, I knew peace was over. She slammed the brakes, rolled down the window, and with her usual nasal bark shouted, "You can't park that monstrosity here. This is a residential street." I blinked at her, too tired for theatrics, but I managed a half-smile. "It's not just a monstrosity, Karen. It's a licensed emergency vehicle. Big difference." That only fueled her. She whipped out her phone, muttering something about tow trucks and HOA violations. I honestly thought she was bluffing. Who in their right mind calls a tow on an ambulance? But I should have known better. By the time I went inside to grab coffee, I heard the clank of chains outside. She had actually flagged down a local tow driver, an eager young guy who looked more confused than convinced, and was pointing dramatically at my rig like it was an abandoned junk car. I came out just in time to hear her tell him, "Hook it up. I don't care what he says, it's not allowed here." The tow driver hesitated, clearly aware of how insane it looked, but she pressed forward, waving HOA paperwork that meant absolutely nothing. She wasn't doing this because of bylaws or aesthetics, she was doing it because she thrived on control. Karen needed everyone to know she could bend the neighborhood to her will. I stepped between the truck and my ambulance, arms crossed, tone calm but sharp enough to cut glass. "You touch this vehicle, you'll be committing a felony. It's state-owned. You'd have better luck stealing a police cruiser." The driver froze, caught between the devil and the law, but Karen didn't back down. She screamed about property values, about how she didn't work her whole life to live in a neighborhood that looked like a firehouse parking lot. The shouting drew neighbors from their porches. Phones came out, recording every second. Karen's face flushed red with the pressure of an audience, and she doubled down, insisting the HOA had the right to remove any eyesore. That's when it happened, mid-screech, mid-hand wave, mid-power trip, her voice cracked into a gasp. She staggered backward, clutched her chest, and crumpled to the pavement in front of the very ambulance she wanted gone. For a split second, silence hung over the crowd, broken only by the sound of her nails scraping asphalt. Then all eyes turned to me, the EMT, the guy she had spent months harassing. My heart didn't pound out of panic, it pounded with irony. Of course it would be me. Of course she'd drop in front of my rig. And in that frozen moment I had a choice. Let her choke on her arrogance or prove that unlike her, I played the long game. Too many people with too many opinions circling a crisis. Karen lay on the pavement, gasping in short, shallow bursts, while the small crowd of neighbors fumbled with their phones, half recording, half pretending they knew CPR. The tow truck driver stood frozen, chain hook still in his hand, looking like he'd just been cast in a courtroom drama where he was about to be Exhibit A. I knelt beside her, not because I liked her, but because instinct and training take over when someone's life is measured in oxygen-starved seconds. Her pulse was racing, erratic, but still there. I looked around and snapped, "Call 911. And before anyone asks, yes, I know I'm the EMT, but it doesn't mean I carry a spare hospital in my pocket." A neighbor stammered, You have an ambulance right there, don't you?" That was true, but off-duty rigs aren't stocked like they are on the clock. The drugs were locked up, the defibrillator secured, and my partner wasn't here to assist. I had nothing but my hands, my training, and a neighborhood full of gawkers who'd rather film than fetch. Still, I started chest compressions when her breathing faltered, pressing down in steady rhythm, aware of the irony that the same chest had been puffed with entitlement 10 minutes earlier as she tried to throw my career into a ditch. By the time the paramedics screeched into the cul-de-sac, blue lights bouncing off siding and manicured hedges, I was sweating. Not from exertion, I've done compressions for hours, but from the weight of the situation. Karen's collapse was about to shift from medical emergency to neighborhood legend, and I knew every detail would be twisted into HOA fodder. The paramedics took over with professional speed, sliding oxygen over her face, pushing meds I didn't have access to. They asked who found her. I raised my hand, explained, then stepped back as they loaded her into their gurney. She wasn't out of the woods, but she wasn't gone either. The ambulance rolled away, and the silence it left was deafening. The crowd dispersed, whispering in tones I knew well, the mix of gossip and disbelief. And I was left standing with the tow driver, who now looked like he wanted to dissolve into thin air. "Look, man," he said nervously, "she told me it was a code violation. I didn't know it was, your vehicle." I gave him a look so sharp it nearly cut his toe chain in half. "Here's a rule of thumb. If someone wants you to steal an ambulance, maybe double-check the paperwork." He muttered an apology, slunk back into his truck, and peeled away, leaving tire marks on Karen's dignity. I should have gone inside and collapsed into bed, but something told me the day wasn't done with me yet. Sure enough, an hour later, my doorbell rang. Standing there were two men in cheap suits, HOA board members, the type who thought clipboards equaled power. The taller one, all sunburnt forehead and too much cologne, cleared his throat. "We heard about the incident. First, we hope Karen's all right. But second, we need to discuss the ambulance." I almost laughed in his face. "She just had a heart attack in front of it, and your priority is whether it's an eyesore?" The shorter one, clutching a manila folder like it contained nuclear launch codes, piped up. "We're just concerned about property values. Residents don't want emergency vehicles permanently parked in the subdivision. It makes people think crime rates are high." My patience, already thinner than a hospital gown, snapped. "She nearly died because of her obsession with control. And you're telling me a vehicle that saves lives is bad for curb appeal?" They exchanged glances, realizing they'd stepped into a rhetorical minefield. But the taller one pressed on, because power addicts never know when to quit. "Technically, the HOA bylaws say commercial vehicles can't be left in driveways overnight." I raised an eyebrow. "Technically, this isn't commercial. It's municipal. Which means your bylaws don't apply." They stammered, tried to reframe, but I cut them off with the calm, surgical tone I reserved for idiots and emergencies alike. "Tell you what. Draft whatever violation letter you want. When the city lawyers finish laughing, I'll frame it and hang it in my garage." They left unsatisfied, muttering about special meetings and enforcement committees. I closed the door, leaned against it, and realized I wasn't just dealing with Karen anymore, I was dealing with an entire board emboldened by her reign of terror. Karen's heart might have given out, but her grip on the HOA was still strong. Later that evening, I got a call from the hospital. Not as a medical professional, but as her neighbor. Karen had survived, stabilized after a procedure, and was expected to recover. The nurse explained she'd already been asking for updates on the ambulance situation, as though her heart attack had been a scheduling hiccup in her campaign of control. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or groan. Even lying in a hospital bed, hooked to monitors, she couldn't stop plotting. The next morning, the neighborhood buzz was electric. Some residents dropped by, not out of concern for her, but to finally speak their minds about her tyranny. A father from down the street said, "Honestly, man, she's been riding all of us for years. Trash cans out 5 minutes early, Christmas lights too bright, grass a half-inch too tall. Maybe now people will realize she's gone too far." Another neighbor, a quiet retiree, admitted she'd once fined him for having a bird feeder visible from the street. Their resentment was a bonfire, and Karen's collapse had thrown gasoline on it. Still, I knew Karen. The hospital stay wasn't going to humble her. It was going to harden her. She would come back not with gratitude, but with vengeance. She had nearly died in front of my rig, and to someone like her, that wasn't a warning from life. It was a personal humiliation. She'd make sure the HOA turned her anger into action. That night, as I sat on my porch, sipping coffee and watching the quiet street, I saw two things that confirmed my suspicion. First, the board president's car pulling into Karen's driveway, headlights off like he was sneaking in. Second, the faint glow of porch lights flicking on up and down the block as neighbors peeked out, curious about what schemes were being whispered behind her curtains. The war wasn't over. Karen was recovering, and with her would come a storm brewed not just of entitlement, but of revenge. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion still clinging to me, but a smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth. They didn't realize it yet, but they weren't playing chess with me, they were playing Operation. And I never lost when someone else's heart was on the line. Karen came back from the hospital faster than anyone expected. Most people, after a heart attack, might retreat into humility, count their blessings, or at least fake gratitude toward the guy who kept them alive. Not Karen. She returned like a monarch reclaiming her throne. Her SUV reappeared in the driveway within a week, decorated with a smug new bumper sticker that read, HOA Pride. The first morning I saw it, I actually laughed out loud. This woman had stared at death and decided her legacy was still going to be dictating how tall other people's grass could be. The real surprise, though, was the entourage. She didn't just limp back alone, she had board members trailing her like courtiers. The president, the secretary, even the guy who usually never showed up for anything but free donuts at meetings. They carried clipboards, clip-on ties, and the kind of nervous smiles that suggested they'd been lectured for days. My mailbox soon filled with neatly folded violation notices, each one more absurd than the last. One claimed my ambulance counted as unregistered equipment. Another said the emergency light bar was visual pollution. The cherry on top? A citation for unneighborly conduct. No explanation given. Just the label, stamped and signed by Karen herself, as though she'd founded her own judiciary system from her hospital bed. I didn't take the bait right away. Part of playing the long game is letting your opponent overextend. So I collected every notice in a neat binder, wrote the dates in the margins, and carried on. Neighbors whispered to me at the grocery store, offering sympathetic nods and horror stories of their own. One woman confessed Karen had once ordered her to repaint her shutters because they clashed with the HOA's spirit. Another guy admitted he'd paid a fine for leaving his basketball hoop visible for one afternoon. It was clear. Karen had resumed her reign, and the ambulance was her chosen battlefield. Her tactics escalated quickly. First came the petty stuff. Anonymous complaints about noise, even though I worked night shifts and the only sound coming from my house was the hum of a fridge. Then she moved to intimidation. I caught her standing at the edge of my driveway one afternoon, measuring tape in hand, scribbling notes on a legal pad like she was auditing NASA. I stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, and asked if she needed a ladder to check my gutters too. Her glare could have curdled milk. She snapped that I was officially on HOA probation, as if that phrase had any meaning outside her imagination. But the real blow came one Friday evening. I got home to find a bright orange sticker slapped across my ambulance windshield, tow scheduled, HOA order. My first reaction was disbelief, followed by the kind of laugh that makes your stomach hurt. She had actually refiled for a tow, despite what had happened last time. The difference was, this time she wasn't bluffing. She'd convinced the board to hire a private towing company on retainer for community enforcement. They were scheduled to come in 48 hours. I didn't panic. Instead, I opened my binder, snapped photos of every violation letter, and called a lawyer I knew from past runs. He wasn't just any lawyer. He specialized in municipal law. When I explained the situation, he whistled. She's picking the wrong fight. An ambulance is exempt from HOA rules. If she actually tries to tow it, it's not just illegal, it's actionable. You could own half the HOA by the time this is done. His advice was simple. Let them walk into the trap. Document everything. Don't interfere. So I waited. The next 48 hours were oddly calm, like the eye of a hurricane. Karen strutted around the neighborhood, basking in the whispers of her supporters, reminding anyone who'd listen that the eyesore would be gone by Monday. I noticed fewer neighbors nodding along this time, though. Some rolled their eyes openly. The incident with her heart had shifted public opinion more than she realized. Still, the board marched behind her, blinded by loyalty or fear. Monday morning came, and right on cue, a tow truck rumbled into the cul-de-sac. Not the same nervous kid from before. This was a larger company, 2 drivers, professional rigs. Karen practically danced down her driveway, clipboard in hand, barking instructions like a foreman. I sat on my porch, sipping coffee, camera rolling discreetly from my phone. The drivers inspected the ambulance, looked at each other, and hesitated. They knew something was off. One of them asked for documentation. Karen thrust forward her HOA order like it was the Declaration of Independence. That's when I stood up. Calm. Collected. I walked over, introduced myself, and explained, very slowly, that the vehicle was owned by the city, registered as emergency equipment, and fully exempt from HOA jurisdiction. I offered to show them the registration papers stored inside. The drivers went pale. One of them muttered, "We can't touch this. If we tow it, we're liable." Karen exploded. She shrieked that they had no choice, that she was the HOA, that rules were rules. She even stomped her foot like a child denied dessert. The drivers, wisely, refused. They packed up their gear, apologized to me, and drove off. Karen didn't follow them. Instead, she turned on me. Her face flushed purple, and I could see the veins pulsing near her temples. "You think you're clever," she hissed. "But this isn't over. If I have to rewrite the bylaws myself, that thing will be gone." I tilted my head, half-smile returning, and said, "Careful, Karen. Last time you got this worked up, it didn't end well for your heart." The words slipped out sharper than I intended, but the silence that followed was priceless. Neighbors gasped. A few even chuckled. Karen's eyes widened, not from pain this time, but from rage so fierce she couldn't speak. She stormed back inside, slamming her door hard enough to rattle porch lights. The neighborhood was buzzing within hours. Text threads lit up, gossip circled, and suddenly, people who had lived under her thumb for years were talking openly about rebellion. "She's lost it," one neighbor whispered to me that evening. "Trying to tow an ambulance? That's the line." Another neighbor offered to testify if it came to court. Even the board secretary, who always followed Karen like a shadow, looked uneasy when I caught him sneaking glances at me. The real kicker came in my mailbox the next day. An official letter, not from the HOA, but from City Hall. It stated that my vehicle was legally protected, and that any attempts by the HOA to interfere would be considered harassment of emergency services. In the margin, someone from the office had scribbled a note, "We've had complaints about this HOA before. Keep us posted." That was the moment I realized the game had changed. This wasn't just me versus Karen anymore. It was me versus an entire system she'd corrupted, and I had the law leaning in my favor. She thought she could out-muscle me with paperwork and threats, but I had something stronger: patience, documentation, and a neighborhood slowly waking up to the reality that their queen wasn't immortal, wasn't invincible, and sure as hell wasn't above the law. And yet, deep down, I knew Karen wouldn't quit. She'd already risked her health, her dignity, and her credibility to win this fight. Next time, she wouldn't just send letters or tow truck. Next time, she'd escalate beyond anything the HOA had ever seen. If there was one thing Karen hated more than losing, it was losing publicly. The failed tow attempt had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By midweek, people were retelling the story at block parties, in the grocery store, even in line at the gas station. Every retelling got a little spicier. Some said she screamed so hard her face turned purple, others claimed she threw her clipboard at the tow driver. I didn't correct any of it. Why ruin free publicity? The damage to her reputation was already done, but instead of retreating, she doubled down. I woke up one morning to find a bright yellow poster stapled to every utility pole on my street. Emergency vehicle parked illegally. Lowering property values. Demand action now. At the bottom was the HOA hotline number. Karen's personal cell, thinly disguised. It was such a ridiculous piece of propaganda that I almost admired the effort. She'd tried legal notices, she'd tried intimidation, now she was running a full-on smear campaign. The best part? The poster had a grainy photo of my ambulance taken at night, headlights glowing like the devil himself lived in my driveway. Subtlety was never Karen's strength. The calls started soon after. Not to me, to the city. She'd filed complaints with zoning, with code enforcement, even with the fire marshal. Each agency sent a representative, and each one left shaking their head. One city inspector, clipboard in hand, actually chuckled as he told me, "She's filed 3 separate complaints this week. None of them stick." Off the record? I think she's wasting her own HOA's money. He promised to file a report noting the harassment, and that's when it clicked for me. Karen wasn't just annoying anymore. She was crossing into dangerous territory where her obsession might end up costing her everything. The board, however, didn't see it that way. They saw her crusade as a rallying cry. Suddenly, HOA meetings became miniature trials where my name was dragged through the mud. I know this because neighbors who still attended told me about it. "She brought a slideshow," one said with disbelief. "Charts, photos, even a map of where your ambulance supposedly blocks the line of sight. She made it sound like you're single-handedly collapsing the economy." Another neighbor whispered that she'd called for a vote to amend the bylaws specifically to ban all emergency or municipal vehicles from residential lots. I could have marched into one of those meetings, thrown down the legal exemption papers, and ended the debate on the spot. But that wasn't the long game. The long game was letting Karen pile evidence against herself, letting her rage blind her while the neighborhood grew more and more uncomfortable with her leadership. I wanted her to burn herself out publicly, not be defeated by a single knockout punch. Of course, Karen didn't rely solely on bureaucracy. She was cunning enough to know optics mattered. One evening, I caught her standing in the street with a small group of allies, waving their arms dramatically as they posed for photos next to my ambulance. They made faces of disgust, pointed at the light bar, gestured toward their houses. It was theater, pure and simple. I almost expected her to hire a marching band. Then came the letters. Not the official ones, but anonymous slips of paper shoved into my mailbox and taped to my door. "Move the ambulance. You don't belong here." Karen was right. The handwriting varied, but the tone was the same. Desperate attempts to scare me into compliance. I kept every one, dated and sealed in plastic sleeve. If they thought intimidation worked on someone who'd knelt in roadside blood at 3 in the morning, they were mistaken. Fear wasn't in my vocabulary anymore. But intimidation wasn't the only weapon she tried. One Friday, I got home from a shift to find a police cruiser idling in front of my house. My stomach tightened. Cops at your door rarely means good news. The officer, though, was almost sheepish. "We got a call about an illegally parked emergency vehicle blocking the street. Dispatch sent me to check." He gestured to the perfectly legal, fully registered ambulance tucked neatly in my driveway. His eyes rolled. "Look, between you and me, this is the 4th time this month. We know who's making the calls. We're documenting it, but keep your phone handy. It's only going to escalate." That night, my neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, debating in voices just loud enough for me to hear. Some supported me openly, others were too scared to speak out, but the tide was turning. Karen had always thrived on secrecy. Private fines, quiet threats, whispered warnings. Now her war was public, loud, and undeniably petty. And people were getting tired of it. Still, I underestimated how far she would go. The next twist came on a Saturday morning when I walked out to find my ambulance tagged with a massive neon sticker. "Illegally parked vehicle. Subject to removal." It looked official at first glance, complete with a fake city seal she must have printed at home. Neighbors stopped to stare, whispering as if the law had finally caught up to me. But I peeled the sticker off, showed it to a city contact, and within hours had confirmation. It was a forgery. A forgery that carried potential criminal charges. When I confronted the HOA board about it, they deflected, claimed no knowledge, and suggested it must have been a rogue resident. But their nervous eyes gave them away. Even they knew Karen was spinning out of control. One board member actually pulled me aside and muttered, "She's dragging us all down with her. Just be patient." Patient I could do. What I hadn't expected was the neighborhood rebellion brewing in the background. Small acts of defiance started popping up. One family parked their RV in the driveway for the first time in years, daring Karen to fine them. Another neighbor installed Christmas lights in September, a middle finger to her endless aesthetic rules. Even the quiet retiree down the street, who'd once been fined for bird feeders, proudly set up 3 of them on his lawn. Karen, fresh from her hospital scare, suddenly faced a block full of residents who weren't afraid anymore. And yet, she still had one card to play. One that could shift the battle from petty fines to something far more dangerous. The city contacts who'd been visiting me dropped a quiet warning one afternoon. "She's petitioned for an official injunction. Wants the city to declare your ambulance a zoning violation." I laughed at first, thinking it was another empty bluff. But then the inspector leaned closer. "If she pushes it hard enough, it could go to court. She's weaponizing the legal system now." That's when I realized Karen wasn't fighting to win anymore. She was fighting to destroy. If she couldn't control me through fines, intimidation, or propaganda, she would drag me into months of legal battles, bleed me with paperwork, and turn the neighborhood into a circus. She wasn't protecting property values, she was protecting her pride. I sat on my porch that night, binder of evidence at my feet, watching the sun dip behind manicured hedges and listening to the quiet hum of a neighborhood on edge. Karen thought she had cornered me with her injunction. What she didn't realize was that the city had already grown weary of her endless complaints. What she didn't realize was that my binder wasn't just full of her violations, it was full of ammunition. And what she definitely didn't realize was that the neighbors she thought were loyal subjects were preparing to revolt. By the time the injunction papers landed in my mailbox, the neighborhood was split into 2 camps. Those still clinging to Karen's iron grip out of fear, and those who had finally woken up and realized they didn't need to live under her rule. The envelope was thick, stuffed with legal jargon and stamped with the city's seal. She'd actually done it. She'd managed to file a petition demanding my ambulance be declared a zoning violation. She was dragging me to court, not for damages, not for safety reasons, but for daring to exist outside her control. I sat at my kitchen table flipping through the pages, each one more absurd than the last. She'd claimed my vehicle was lowering property values by scaring off potential buyers. She'd argued it created visual blight. She even included sworn statements from 2 board members who insisted the flashing emergency lights caused undue stress when activated. Never mind that I hadn't flipped those lights on once since parking at home. The whole thing read like a manifesto of entitlement. But here's the kicker. She didn't realize how much she'd exposed herself. My lawyer, the municipal specialist, called me within hours of reviewing the case. "This is the most poorly constructed injunction I've seen in 20 years. She doesn't have a leg to stand on. And frankly, if she keeps this up, she's opening herself, and the HOA, to counterclaims." He recommended we not just fight it, but prepare to countersue for harassment and abuse of authority. His tone was almost gleeful, like a shark who smelled blood in the water. Word of the court case spread quickly. Neighbors who'd once been too afraid to speak up now came to me with offers. "Do you need statements? I'll testify. She fined me for leaving my hose out. I've got the letter she sent me about my Christmas wreath. You can use it." My binder grew thicker every day, a catalogue of every petty cruelty Karen had inflicted on the community. What started as my personal defense was morphing into a rebellion dossier. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. Karen arrived like she was walking into a royal coronation, pearls, a sharp blazer, hair lacquered into submission. She flanked herself with 2 board members, both of whom looked like reluctant extras in her drama. I walked in with my lawyer and a stack of evidence so heavy it made a thud when I set it on the defendant's table. A few neighbors slipped into the gallery seats, some to support me, others out of sheer curiosity. The judge, a weary-looking man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, opened the session by glancing at the paperwork and muttering, "This better be good." Karen went first. She launched into a tirade about neighborhood values, the sanctity of bylaws, and the disgrace of having an ambulance in view of her manicured lawn. She spoke with the fervor of someone who believed the courtroom was her stage, her audience captive. But as she rambled, the judge's eyebrows inched higher. At one point, she theatrically pointed at me and declared, "He has turned our peaceful community into a firehouse parking lot." That drew a cough that suspiciously sounded like a laugh from one of the neighbors in the back row. When it was our turn, my lawyer didn't waste time. He presented the city documents declaring emergency vehicles exempt from HOA regulations. He produced the forged towing sticker, the harassment letters, the fraudulent official notice. He even played video of the failed tow attempt, complete with Karen screaming in the background about bylaws while the tow driver refused. The judge leaned back, pinched the bridge of his nose, and sighed audibly. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, addressing her formally, "this is not only frivolous, it borders on malicious." Karen's face flushed crimson. She tried to interrupt, waving her stack of papers like a weapon, but the judge shut her down with a single raised hand. He dismissed her petition on the spot and issued a warning. Any further harassment directed at me or my vehicle could be grounds for civil penalties. My lawyer, sensing blood in the water, immediately requested permission to file a countersuit. The judge didn't rule on it right then, but he didn't deny the possibility either. The courtroom emptied, but the fallout was only beginning. By the time Karen stormed out, her blazer askew and her bored allies scurrying to keep up, word had already hit the neighborhood group chat. Within hours, the cul-de-sac was buzzing louder than a fire alarm. People who'd stayed neutral were suddenly emboldened. A petition circulated, not one of Karen's, but one demanding her removal as HOA president. What shocked me wasn't that people signed, it was how fast. Families who'd lived in fear of her fines for years scribbled their names without hesitation. Even the quiet retiree with the bird feeders signed first, pen shaking slightly as he grinned. Within 2 days, more than half the community had signed. By the end of the week, the number was enough to trigger a special vote. Karen, of course, didn't go quietly. She canvassed door to door, railing against me like I was some invading general, warning that if she lost power, the neighborhood would descend into chaos. But her words had lost their sting. People remembered the ambulance, the heart attack, the failed tow, the forged sticker. They remembered that when she collapsed, I saved her life, and she thanked me by trying to ruin mine. Her grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and she could feel it. The special meeting was held in the community center on a warm Saturday morning. Folding chairs packed the room, neighbors shoulder to shoulder, the air electric with anticipation. Karen sat at the front, gavel in hand, her jaw tight. When the vote was called, people lined up one by one to drop their slips into a box. She tried to smile, tried to look confident, but I could see the panic twitching at the corner of her mouth. When the tally was finished, the room erupted. She'd lost by a landslide. Not just by a few votes, by a margin so wide it left no room for doubt. She was officially removed as HOA president. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free from her reign. The new board president, a soft-spoken woman who'd once been fined for having too many lawn gnomes, stepped up to the podium and promised transparency, fairness, and a fresh start. Karen didn't stick around for the celebration. She stormed out, muttering about lawsuits and vendettas, but her voice was drowned out by cheers. Neighbors shook my hand, clapped me on the back, even hugged me. One man grinned and said, "You didn't just save her life, you saved all of ours from living under her." That night, for the first time in months, the cul-de-sac felt different. Laughter drifted from porches, kids played basketball in driveways without fear of citations, and my ambulance sat quietly in its spot, no longer a target but a symbol. A symbol of resistance, of patience, of what happens when entitlement crashes headfirst into reality. I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, binder of evidence tucked safely away inside. The war was over. Karen had been dethroned, not by me alone, but by a neighborhood finally willing to stand together. And though I knew she wasn't the type to disappear entirely, I also knew she'd never wield the same power again. In the end, she'd tried to tow my ambulance, but it wasn't the tow truck that brought her down. It was her own heart, both the one that failed in front of my rig, and the one that had never been big enough to hold the community she claimed to protect.